My name is Jasmine Washington, and I'm writing this from the home I finally purchased after 3 years of fighting housing discrimination so systematic and pervasive that I began to question whether the American dream of homeownership was ever meant to include people who look like me. At 32, I'm an emergency medicine physician earning $180,000 annually at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, with excellent credit, substantial savings, and all the financial qualifications that should make me an ideal homebuyer. Yet I was denied mortgages, shown inferior properties, steered away from desirable neighborhoods, and subjected to discriminatory practices that would have prevented me from ever owning property if I hadn't documented everything and fought back with legal representation. My story isn't unique. It's the reality for millions of Black Americans who discover that income and education provide no protection against housing discrimination that systematically excludes minorities from wealth-building opportunities that white families take for granted. I began searching for my first home in 2021, motivated by the desire to build equity instead of paying rent and excited about the prospect of owning property in Atlanta, where I had established my medical career and planned to remain long-term. With a six-figure salary, $60,000 saved for a down payment, and a credit score of 780, I expected the home buying process to be straightforward and empowering. I had researched neighborhoods, identified properties within my budget, and prepared all the financial documentation that lenders require. What I hadn't prepared for was discovering that my race would be a bigger factor in housing decisions than my income, credit, or professional qualifications. The first sign of discrimination came during my initial meetings with real estate agents, where subtle but unmistakable patterns emerged that would characterize the entire home buying experience. When I called agents whose listings appeared in upscale neighborhoods with good schools and low crime rates, I was frequently told that those properties had already sold or were under contract, even when the listings were recent and showed no pending sales. When I insisted on seeing specific homes, agents would schedule showings but then arrive late, seem unprepared, and spend minimal time explaining property features or neighborhood amenities. The contrast became obvious when I had my white colleague Dr. Sarah Mitchell call the same agents about identical properties. She was immediately offered multiple showing times, provided detailed information about neighborhoods and schools, and given enthusiastic presentations about property values and investment potential. When we compared our experiences, the disparate treatment was so glaring that it couldn't be explained by anything other than racial discrimination that was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but effective enough to systematically limit my housing options. The steering became more obvious as agents consistently directed me toward properties in predominantly Black neighborhoods, regardless of my expressed preferences for areas with good schools, short commutes to the hospital, or specific amenities that were important to me. When I asked to see homes in mixed or predominantly white neighborhoods where I could afford the prices, agents would make comments about how I might be more comfortable in areas where there were people like me, or suggest that certain neighborhoods might not be the right fit for my lifestyle. The most blatant steering occurred when agent Jessica Reynolds told me directly that she was concerned about my adjustment to a particular suburb that was 85% white, suggesting that I might face social challenges or feel isolated in an area where I would be one of few Black residents. Her assumption that I would be unwelcome or uncomfortable in integrated neighborhoods revealed the racist thinking that underlies housing segregation, the belief that racial separation is natural and that minorities should limit themselves to designated areas regardless of their preferences or qualifications. The mortgage discrimination was even more systematic and financially devastating than the real estate agent bias. Despite my excellent credit score and substantial income, I was repeatedly denied loans or offered subprime mortgages with higher interest rates and fees than what my qualifications should have generated. Bank loan officers would scrutinize my application with levels of documentation and verification that seemed excessive, requiring employment letters, tax returns, bank statements, and asset verification that went far beyond standard underwriting procedures. The most egregious example occurred at First National Bank, where loan officer Michael Patterson spent weeks requesting additional documentation for my mortgage application, including letters from my medical school verifying my degree, employment contracts proving my hospital position was permanent, and even character references from colleagues who could vouch for my professional stability. When I asked why these requirements were necessary for someone with my credit and income profile, Patterson explained that medical professionals, sometimes, had irregular income patterns that required extra verification, an explanation that made no sense given that my employment was salaried and stable. When I finally received the loan decision from First National, I was approved for a mortgage amount that was $75,000 less than what my income and credit should have qualified me for, with an interest rate that was 0.8% higher than advertised rates for borrowers with similar financial profiles. The terms would have cost me over $50,000 in additional interest payments over the life of the loan, money that would go directly from my wealth-building efforts into bank profits generated through discriminatory lending practices. The discrimination became undeniable when Dr. Mitchell, who earned slightly less than me and had a lower credit score, was approved by the same bank for a mortgage amount that was $100,000 higher than my approval, with an interest rate that was a full percentage point lower than what I had been offered. When we compared our loan documents, the disparity was so obvious that it could only be explained by racial bias in the underwriting process that systematically undervalued Black borrowers, regardless of their actual financial qualifications. The insurance discrimination added another layer of financial penalty for being a Black homebuyer. Insurance companies consistently quoted me higher premiums for homeowners insurance in the same neighborhoods where white buyers received lower rates, often using risk assessment algorithms that incorporated zip code data reflecting historical redlining patterns rather than current crime statistics or property values. The insurance disparities meant that even if I could secure a mortgage and purchase a home, my ongoing ownership costs would be artificially inflated due to racial bias in risk calculation. The neighborhood resistance became apparent when I finally found a property I wanted to purchase in a predominantly white suburb with excellent schools and property values. The seller, Margaret Coleman, initially accepted my offer, which was competitive and backed by solid financing. But during the inspection period, she suddenly developed concerns about timing and suggested that perhaps we should reconsider the transaction to ensure it was right for everyone involved. Her realtor later admitted that some neighbors had expressed concerns about changes to the neighborhood's character, language that was clearly coded racial objection to my potential residency. The most devastating example of housing discrimination occurred when I discovered that a house I had been told was sold had actually remained on the market for 3 additional weeks after my supposed unsuccessful offer. I learned about the continued availability when I drove past the property and noticed that the for sale sign was still visible, leading me to call the listing agent and inquire about the status. When pressed for details, the agent admitted that the previous sale had fallen through and the property was available, but then claimed that my previous offer had been withdrawn by my agent, something that had never happened. The documentation I maintained throughout the home buying process became crucial evidence of systematic discrimination that affected not just individual transactions, but the entire market system. I saved emails, recorded phone conversations where legally permitted, and documented disparate treatment that demonstrated patterns of racial bias across multiple agents, lenders, and service providers. The evidence revealed that housing discrimination wasn't isolated incidents, but rather a coordinated system of exclusion that effectively maintained residential segregation despite fair housing laws. The breaking point came when I realized that 3 years of searching had produced only frustration, financial costs, and psychological damage without resulting in homeownership despite my obvious qualifications and financial resources. I had spent thousands of dollars on application fees, inspection costs, and legal consultations while watching my white colleagues purchase homes with less income and lower credit scores. The systematic exclusion was preventing me from building wealth through property ownership while diverting my savings toward rental payments that generated no equity or investment return. The legal intervention began when I contacted the Fair Housing Law Project, a civil rights organization that specializes in documenting and prosecuting housing discrimination cases. Attorney Maria Rodriguez reviewed my documentation and immediately recognized patterns of discrimination that violated federal fair housing laws and provided grounds for legal action against multiple defendants, including real estate agents, lenders, and sellers who had engaged in discriminatory practices. The investigation process involved sending white and black testers to agents and lenders I had dealt with, creating controlled conditions where the only variable was race while income, credit, and other qualifications remained constant. The testing results provided clear evidence of disparate treatment, with white testers receiving better service, more favorable loan terms, and access to properties that had been denied to me despite my superior qualifications. The evidence was so compelling that several defendants agreed to settlements rather than face trial where their discriminatory practices would be exposed publicly. The legal victory came 18 months later when First National Bank agreed to pay $150,000 in damages and provide me with a mortgage at the rate I should have received originally, while also agreeing to undergo fair lending training and federal monitoring of their loan approval processes. Real estate agent Jessica Reynolds lost her license after the State Real Estate Commission found that her steering practices violated professional ethics and fair housing regulations. Margaret Coleman faced federal fair housing charges for refusing to sell to me based on race, ultimately settling for an undisclosed amount while agreeing to fair housing education and community service. The home purchase that finally succeeded occurred through an agent recommended by the Fair Housing Law Project, someone who understood fair housing requirements and was committed to providing equal service regardless of buyer race. The process was dramatically different from my previous experiences, with the agent showing me properties based on my stated preferences and budget rather than assumptions about where I belonged. The mortgage came from a credit union that had been recommended by civil rights organizations for their fair lending practices and commitment to serving minority borrowers. The house I eventually purchased is a beautiful 4-bedroom home in an integrated neighborhood with excellent schools, a short commute to the hospital, and property values that have appreciated significantly since my purchase. The neighborhood has been welcoming, and several neighbors have become genuine friends who appreciate my contributions to the community through volunteer work with local schools and nonprofit organizations. The homeownership experience has been everything I hoped it would be, providing stability, equity building, and the satisfaction of having my own space to customize and improve. The wealth-building impact of homeownership has already been substantial, with my property appreciating $40,000 in value during the first 2 years of ownership, while my monthly mortgage payments build equity that would have been lost to rent payments. The tax advantages of homeownership have reduced my annual tax burden by several $1,000s, money that I can invest in retirement accounts and other wealth-building vehicles. The financial security that comes from owning property has also allowed me to make larger investments in my medical practice and professional development. The advocacy work that emerged from my housing discrimination experience has become an important part of my community involvement and professional identity. I now work with fair housing organizations to educate other potential homebuyers about their rights, document discrimination when it occurs, and support legal challenges to discriminatory practices that maintain residential segregation. I speak at medical conferences about the health impacts of housing discrimination and the role that healthcare professionals can play in addressing systemic racism in housing markets. The education component of my advocacy includes working with real estate professionals, lenders, and community organizations to improve understanding of fair housing requirements and the ongoing reality of housing discrimination. Many people in the real estate industry are genuinely surprised to learn about modern discriminatory practices, and education can change behavior while also creating allies who support fair housing enforcement and prevention efforts. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. The Fair Housing Law Project and similar civil rights organizations provide legal representation, investigation services, and advocacy support for victims of housing discrimination seeking accountability and compensation. HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, enforces fair housing laws and provides resources for reporting discrimination, understanding housing rights, and accessing first-time homebuyer programs designed to increase minority homeownership. Community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and credit unions often provide more equitable lending practices and specialized programs for minority homebuyers who face discrimination from traditional banks. Fair housing testing organizations document discriminatory practices through controlled investigations that provide evidence for legal action and policy reform efforts. Homebuyer education programs specifically designed for minorities provide information about fair housing rights, lending options, and strategies for navigating potential discrimination during the home buying process. Real estate professionals committed to fair housing can be identified through organizations like the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, NAREB, and local fair housing councils that maintain lists of trained agents. Down payment assistance programs and first-time homebuyer grants help minority families overcome wealth gaps that result from historical housing discrimination and limited access to homeownership. Legal aid organizations provide free or low-cost legal services for fair housing cases, helping victims who might not otherwise be able to afford legal representation to fight discrimination. Today, when I meet other minorities who are struggling with housing discrimination or feeling defeated by the home buying process, I tell them that documentation, legal support, and persistence can overcome systematic discrimination even when it feels impossible. Your right to fair housing is protected by federal law, and there are organizations committed to enforcing those rights when they're violated. Homeownership is a crucial component of wealth building and economic security, and you deserve equal access to housing opportunities regardless of your race or background. The discrimination is real, but so are the legal remedies and support systems that can help you achieve your homeownership goals.